In our final topic on government intervention, we'll talk about what happens if the government intervenes in markets where there is market power, when the government might want to intervene or might not want to intervene in markets which are monopolized and or if not perfect monopolies. We studied, say, duopolies or oligopolies, where you have a handful of firms. We studied monopolistic competition, where there is some price setting power. In all of those markets, you see a lower than the perfectly competitive quantity, leading to deadweight loss. So the question in this chapter is whether the costs of government intervention would outweigh surplus lost by market monopolization. In chapters 10 and 11, when we did some of the mathematical monopoly examples, we demonstrated that the potential consumer surplus lost by monopolization compared to competitive markets could be very large. Right, so one common policy tool when markets are monopolized is price controls. The government could intervene in the market, enforcing the monopolist to charge a price between marginal cost and demand. But all this does is alter P star, the optimal price the monopolist charges. Okay, this, generally speaking, because the price is going down, isn't going to induce the monopolist to produce a larger quantity. And if you remember our definition of deadweight loss, it stems from there being a lower than the competitive quantity. So the question is it possible to induce the monopolist to produce closer to the competitive quantity? So one possibility would actually be to subsidize the monopolist, thereby reducing the monopolist's marginal cost. And a lot of people would think, well, why would you want to do that? Because the monopolist is already making profit, right? It's the most profitable, reduces consumer surplus as compared to other market structures. So why would you want to subsidize the monopolist? Well, if we want closer to the competitive quantity produced, and the market is monopolized, we know that the competitive quantity won't be produced. The only way is to reduce marginal costs for the monopolist somehow, so that it produces here where MC equals MR, and then we have this price, this quantity, which is the competitive price and quantity. So again, maybe the theory is counterintuitive because monopolists are making lots of profit, reducing consumer surplus, but there are real world examples of the government subsidizing monopolists or oligopolists where we have deadweight loss. For one example would be the government frequently subsidizes airlines so that they fly more routes and they charge a lower price, right? So, you know, the argument is that if you subsidize the monopolist, it'll be higher quantity, lower price. The monopolist also, because it's subsidized, isn't going to reduce its profits much and therefore should be able to create jobs. So that's kind of the pro-monopoly subsidy. And then the argument against subsidizing monopolies would be, yeah, it's great in theory, but can we prove that the monopolist will actually respond to these subsidies by acting like the perfect competitor rather than maintaining its monopoly price and quantity and just using the rest for profits, right? So again, some positives and negatives. And what about a tax on a monopolist? In general, we're going to argue that a tax on a monopolist would not be a good idea in general, because here's our marginal cost with the tax. And then right, marginal cost equals marginal revenue right here, which means the monopolist creates this lower quantity, and then they're going to charge a price that's like right here, which is a higher price. So lower quantity, higher price. If the goal is some sort of consumer protection against monopolization, then graphically, hopefully it's clear that taxing the monopoly would not be a very good policy solution. All right, so what types of policy solutions other than subsidy might we enact in order to get the monopolist to act more like the competitor somewhere out here at point A, producing a higher quantity? There are some possibilities for antitrust regulation. For instance, the Sherman Act of 1890 and Clayton Act of 1914, as well as the FTC Act of 1914, include language that prohibit explicit collusion among oligopolists, which results in the abuse of monopoly power. In general, these three acts combined just result in laws which are intended to prohibit monopolization in markets, especially monopolization in markets where consumers will suffer some sort of welfare loss from monopolization. So one possibility, antitrust. Antitrust is just going to get more competition into the market, breaking up the monopoly into smaller companies, thereby forcing it to act more like the perfect competitor. There's also some possibilities for some forms of centralized production, right? We want a higher quantity in the market. It could be possible for the government to take over production in some areas. Usually doesn't happen on a large scale, but locally we're seeing it here in Fort Collins, right? We think that Comcast is somewhat of an internet monopoly. And so the city of Fort Collins has responded to that by this initiative to put in fiber optic internet, which they would charge at a lower, provide at a lower price to everybody in Fort Collins. Right, so people don't have to go through Fort Collins, but it's one more competitor in the market, which is intended to increase quantity or accessibility and drive down price. Right, again, we don't tend to see centralized production on a large scale here in the United States, but in some cases it does exist here. All right, one more comment I have that isn't in the notes, but it's worth noting. Chapter 11 was talking about price discriminating monopolists. And one of the main takeaways from that chapter, which we didn't really talk about a whole bunch back then, but the price discriminating monopolist actually produces closer to the perfectly competitive quantity. Now we had first degree or perfect price discrimination. And that's bad for consumers, because if the monopolist knows every consumer's willingness to pay, then this whole area would be producer surplus. Right? This person pays this price, all producer surplus. This person pays their willingness to pay, all producer surplus, and so on. Okay, but if it's very hard to be a perfect discriminating monopolist, because you would have to know some way of knowing every person's willingness to pay. So then they talk a little bit about alternative price discrimination, which is like block or group pricing, or also like quantity discounts. And the book argues that those can actually be welfare maximizing compared to the regular monopolist, because again, it encourages sales at kind of a lower price, closer to the perfectly competitive quantity. So again, does the government want to tax monopolists or not? Well, if the consumers are getting zero surplus and they're having to pay very high prices for a good that is a relative need, you can do things like Fort Collins stepping in to try to provide extra internet service, these certain government policies that we've talked about. Something like Sam's Club might be kind of an oligopolist, or I wouldn't call him a monopolist, but there's only a few of those like restricted access, large quantity. You know, you've got Sam's Club or Costco. There might be one or two other brands, but that would be kind of an oligopoly. And that might actually be improving welfare compared to if they weren't allowed to price discriminate in these various ways, like these quantity discounts or different prices for different people, because they're actually producing closer to perfect competition. So if it can be shown that these companies are actually maximizing welfare or improving welfare compared to monopolization, then some forms of price discrimination might actually be acceptable or reasonable, despite what the name implies. Right, the perfect price discrimination where every consumer has to pay exactly the maximum they're willing to pay, that's usually bad for consumers. So if that did exist in reality, usually it's a form of government intervention to really restrict quantity, like a permit type of system, or the government would probably want to intervene in that market so that consumer surplus is not zero.